the end stage of the Weimar Republic, for example. Those are the times where a political structure of any kind must prove its worth, and everyone can see whether it is able to weather the storm or not. And those states of emergency, states of exception, are what Schmitt was mainly concerned about.
Interregnum. Discussions on literature, philosophy, and metapolitics from the time between orders.
Greetings all, and welcome to another edition of Arktos Interregnum. Today we are on a very small number. There are only two of us tonight, since unfortunately both Charles Lyons and Martin Locker could not join us for this episode, so it's going to just be me, John Bruce Leonard, editor-in-chief of Arktos, and our guest for this evening, Nils Wegner. Nils, could you please say hello?
Yeah, hello, and thanks for having me.
Excellent. All right. So the meat of tonight's episode is going to be focused on Carl Schmitt, the German jurist and political scientist. This obviously is a very big subject in and of itself, so there's a lot to talk about just in the life and the thought of Schmitt. And from there, we'll be moving on quite possibly to some other related thinkers and some other related ideas in the same historical period. So without further ado, I'll let Nils say a word of introduction about himself, and from there, if you could begin speaking about maybe a little bit of biographical background on Schmitt, and we can begin with that. So,
yeah, sure. Regarding myself, I'm 30 years old now. After a short side trip as a med student, I chose to rather study the humanities because I'm not that good at math, as it seems, to stay in the natural sciences field. And
that makes two of us, Nils. That makes two of us.
Yeah, well, you can always try at least once.
Exactly.
From 2009 on until 2014, I studied history as a major and German literature studies and political science as minors. And as a historian, I hold a master's degree now. And right after the end of my studies, after my graduation, I started to work for the major publishing house of the German New Right, Arktos, which probably nowadays even most right-wing alt-right Americans might have heard of because of its affiliations with people like Martin Sellner and its translational works, which were to a certain extent conducted by me. I've been translating Roger Devlin's Sexual Utopia and Power into German, as well as Jack Donovan's Becoming a Barbarian. And as well, for another publishing house, I translated Derek Turner's Sea Changes. So far, more works incoming.
Excellent.
Yeah, and here I am now, freelancing pretty much. I've already also done some work for Arktos, like translating Daniel Friedberg's Return of the Real Right. And, here I am now on a Arktos podcast talking about two important thinkers of the at least German and pretty much also international right-wing thinkery.
Fantastic. All right. Yes. And it's probably appropriate to mention that this podcast is actually in belated honor of the birthday of Carl Schmitt, which was the 11th of July, 1888, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's right.
Fantastic. All right.
It's
so
the 130th birthday. It's been the 130th birthday of Carl Schmitt on the 11th. And right before that, on the 4th of July, this very American date, it's been the 15th anniversary of the death of Armin Mohler, who was closely connected to Carl Schmitt and pretty much constructed I would like to call it actually a meme of the conservative revolution, which has ever since been a focal point of the French New Right, and from there the German New Right, and due to the influences of both movements or scenes, whatever, onto the alt-right, I guess it's also of a not too little meaning for the alt-right in and of itself.
Yes, indeed. It's become something of a talking point these days, and a reference point more than that for the ideology and for the growth of certain intellectual milieus of our day. It's a very, very relevant theme. So there's also a lot to be talked about simply in the idea of the conservative revolution. There's a lot to be talked about simply in the name of the conservative revolution. And with any luck, we'll have some chance to touch on that as well. Perhaps we could start from Schmitt. Maybe you could give us a little bit of background on Schmitt, who he was, where and when he lived, and why he's important, why he's worthy of our consideration.
All right. Just let me mention before we go in medias res, as the old Romans would have said, both guys, Schmitt as well as Mohler, have led very interesting lives, especially Schmitt because of his highly criticized and very let's say, ambiguous relation to National Socialism and the Third Reich. And both have published lots and lots of books, and the books written about them are even more and multiplying by the year. So I'll give some rather superficial outline of both men's lives and works, and if there are any detailed questions, I guess we can get into them during the ride.
Fantastic. Let's do that.
All right, so let's start with Carl Schmitt, because he is not only the older one, but also kind of the founding father of Mohler's work. So it's better to handle Mohler afterwards. As you've already mentioned, Carl Schmitt was a jurist and political thinker, political philosopher, who was born on July the 11th, 1888, and died on April the 7th, Easter Sunday, 1985. So he almost reached 100 years.
Uh-huh.
To sum it up shortly, his works during his life mainly centered around questions of authority and handling power, as well as, I'll use the German word here, as well as around Recht, in both its meanings as law and justice as well. He was mainly influenced and determined by three concrete motifs, which another jurist called Helmut Quaritch, who wrote a very readable and poignant summary of his of Schmitt's political work. Those three main topics and motifs would be Catholicism, statism, and nationalism. And regarding Schmitt being influenced by Catholicism, Quaritch chose to call Schmitt's National Socialist episodes as a conversion, a brief conversion, that is. So Schmitt was born in a petty bourgeois Catholic into a petit bourgeois Catholic family in Plettenberg, a rather small town in the Sauerland region of Westphalia. And at first wanted to study classical philology, but was urged by an uncle to rather pursue a career in law, because as it seems, even back then, at the very beginning of the 20th century, the humanities were not too much of a bread job gaining segment of studies.
Some things never change.
Yeah, obviously, but nowadays not even law isn't anymore, because there are far too many lawyers than there are clients. Not even speaking about political law and political justice, but that's an entirely other topic. So in 1907, Carl Schmitt started studying law and legal sciences in Berlin at the Friedrich Wilhelm University, which was the most the highest ranking university in back then Imperial Germany, but coming from a small and rather rural town, he felt repulsed by the big city and the moral degeneracy he seems to have encountered there. So only 1 year later, he chose to change his university to Munich and went for a short trip to Strasbourg, which was then German after the German-French War of 1870, 1871. And at Strasbourg University, he got promoted in 1910 with a dissertation about different judicial types of debt by a national liberal professor by the name of Fritz von Kalkow, who also pursued a political career at that time, and I guess would have been quite astounded by the career of his student later. Schmitt continued his studies and went for a postdoctoral degree, which he reached in 1914, around the beginning of the First World War, with a work about the value of the state and the meaning of the individual, which gained him the professorial title, as well as the habilitation for international law, theory of the state, and legal sciences regarding the state. And in the year after that, in 1915, he was a volunteer for the war, but was commanded to work in a staff in Munich and oversee the censorship bureau there. To his own account, he witnessed the Red Revolution near the end of the war there, and also was eyewitness as one of his comrades who worked in the same building was executed by communists. But as far as I know...
How much do you think that affected his later thought, Nils, these very personal, immediate experiences during the war?
Given that this episode is true, as far as I know, it hasn't been verified or falsified yet. I guess it had a huge impact on Schmitt, who was then 30 years old, that is. And it might have triggered his focus on domestic security and domestic peace to a certain degree. But I'm not a psychologist, and I believe Schmitt himself did never construct a context there, so I won't go out on one leg about this.
Right, certainly. I mean, obviously, the psychological question would be a very specialized one that we don't have to get into. But nonetheless, it is interesting to know that he had such firsthand experiences of the intervention of communism in the lives of citizens, particularly given his very, very strong focus on things like state authority and powers. It's an interesting point.
Yeah, absolutely. And regarding his habilitation thesis, where he already considered the significance of the individual as not being necessarily included in the value of the state, that might also have pushed him to do further research into that and to put some more, let's say, fundamental or radical thoughts out there for, at first, mainly other legals to discuss. After the war, Schmitt remained in Munich and was at first part of the so-called Schwabinger Bohème, the artsy and literal artistical scene of Munich, which centered in Schwabing, which is a part of the inner city of Munich where many Bohemians lived, and there were a lot of street cafes where people would meet and discuss about literature and art. Politics, not so much, but that's a very interesting thing that determined Schmidt's writing style to a very large degree. As I already said, at first he wanted to study classical philology, and throughout his life, Schmitt has been a bit more enthusiastic about anything artsy, especially literature, than about legal issues. He was mainly influenced by writers of the time, like the nowadays sadly forgotten poet Theodor Deubler, to whom he also dedicated a scientifical literal study about one of Deubler's large poems called Das Nordlicht, the Northern Light. And
yes, this is a very interesting aspect of Schmitt, because obviously Schmitt is recalled primarily these days in the political context, but he also, if I'm not mistaken, penned a number of works that were non-political in nature. These are works of literary critique, in this case a work of criticism of poetry. So I mean, that's an interesting aspect of him.
Yeah, obviously. He's also, one of his more famous works is Land und Meer. I guess it has been translated already, Land and Sea. Yeah, I think it has been put out in 1997. Yeah, and that was originally some kind of children's book Schmitt wrote for his daughter, really? in which he put out his thoughts about sea powers versus land powers, but in children's language.
That's fantastic.
He also called himself, afterwards that is, he also called his own literal experiences in the late 1910, early 1920s, Dada avant la lettre. In Munich, he had much contact with one of the founders of Dadaism, Hugo Ball, who became a very close friend of his, and through Hugo Ball also a short and not continued contact to writers like Hermann Hesse, for example. But anyway.
This too is also a fascinating point, because I mean, it's known that also Julius Evola had contact with Dadaism. The contact of these thinkers who are generally perceived as being extraordinarily conservative with the avant-garde of the literary or the artistic circles of their time seems on the face of it something contradictory and paradoxical. Maybe we could even use this as a means of going a little bit into Schmitt's thought, because in a way, his adherence to Dadaism, which I actually had not known about, but in a way that almost is a representation of this idea of conservative, revolutionary conservatism. When we call Schmitt conservative, what do you think that means exactly, Nils? I mean, what are the limits of that kind of characterization? Is that an accurate characterization of this thinker?
Well, we kind of touched the topic of the very term conservative revolution there, because that at first sight seems to be a paradox. You know, conservative revolution, people who want to conserve, to preserve something, but who also want to overturn everything. That's something that does not really work out if you only think of it on a superficial level. And that's something we can get into when we talk about Mohler and his memeing the conservative revolution into existence, I believe. But regarding Schmitt's context to Dadaism, I think it's worth already talking about his position on liberalism now, because back then the Imperial German Reich was, of course, a basically authoritarian state to a certain degree. It was ruled by the Kaiser, but there was the parliament, the Reichstag, and the society itself was organized in a liberal manner. The Reichschancellor was one of the closest associates of the Kaiser, and political decisions could, in fact, not be made by the Kaiser alone without a huge amount of opposition by the Reichstag. It was not like in Weimar Germany, where the Reichspräsident could overrule the parliament at any time, but the parliament in Imperial Germany had a huge determining power with, or if necessary, against the Kaiser. Of course, the Kaiser was the representative of the state and the central figure of imperial rule, but it was not a, to speak in modern terms, a totalitarian authority, but worked together with the parliament. Kind of like the United Kingdom nowadays. As a constitutional monarchy, there is the king as formal head of state, but in fact, daily politics and pretty much all more or less important decisions are made by parliament. Schmitt saw liberalism as organized indecision and the parliamentary democracy as a old-fashioned bourgeois method of rule that was not vital enough anymore to rule in the upcoming mass democracy, and was kind of doomed to lose power sooner or later. So his affiliations with Dadaism, a art form that was all about overturning the old-fashioned structures and creating something completely new out of nothing, kind of like the later Italian futurism, which is in and of itself kind of like a twin brother of Dadaism, but with a more political viewpoint. Those two art forms spoke to many young people back in that time who were conscious enough to see, even before the start of World War I sometimes, that the old structures and the old powers in Europe were about to fail, and it's a pretty common notion about Europe immediately before World War One, that it was kind of a tinderbox, a powder barrel, just waiting for the explosion. So Dadaism emerged after the war as an art form that saw that now the old powers had definitely failed. In Germany, the monarchy was abolished. The Kaiser had to flee Germany and went to Belgium, or was it the Netherlands? I guess it was the Netherlands. And so there was a void, and in politics as well as in culture, because as we all know, Breitbart saying politics is downstream from culture, and the usual stuff about that. A void must not exist. There's always the tendency, if a void suddenly pops up because a system of government fails and leaves only a huge mess behind, as did constitutional monarchy in Germany after the war. There are always powers ready, or powers will emerge to fill this void, because this void must be filled if the failure of the state as a whole is to be prevented. And Dadaism took up this situation of uncertainty and revolutionary ideas and tried to put it into art. Of course, Dada was a heavily left-leaning art form, but Schmitt, throughout his life, always was someone who would not abhor anything from the left, or wouldn't have it in any way, as many milquetoast conservatives are nowadays, that just want to be left alone with left-wing ideas. But Schmitt was interested in anything that he saw as something he could, on an intellectual level, gain from. So that's the Dadaism episode, I guess.
Very interesting. So you've talked a little bit about Schmitt's critique of liberalism. Nowadays that kind of critique of liberalism is rather par for the course in some kinds of circles, but at the same time it's important to recognize that Schmitt is really one of the fathers of this kind of really deep structural critique of the liberal order. So go ahead, Nils.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to hear it, I singled out a quote of Schmitt regarding his stance on liberalism, and that's from one of his most important works. That is politische Theologie. In English, it's political theology, and it's been translated too. I see it's been translated first in 1985 into English. Political theory in and of itself means, and that's a stance that is also pretty much that has also been pretty much pioneered by Schmitt, that all modern politics is downstream from theology, that all political terms and institutions are secularized theological terms and institutions. So in the Middle Ages, you had a king ruling on behalf of his lineage or his benefication by God. And in the modern secular state, you have a president or a dictator who takes his legitimacy from either being elected by the people or installed by some parliamentary institution or stuff like that. It's a huge field. But anyway, we wanted to talk about Schmitt's view on liberalism. And in political theology, he wrote, I'm just making up the translation right as I read the German original, because I don't have the English translation ready. He wrote, as I said, that liberalism was organized in decision and nothing else. And, quote, his very essence is bargaining. It's waiting in indecision and hoping that the definite struggle, the bloody decisive battle, can be turned into a debate in parliament and can be avoided eternally by being turned into a eternal discussion. Schmitt was all about decision and not about the balance of interests in a plural society that liberalism and parliamentarism are all about.
That description of liberalism, of parliamentary functioning, I think will be very familiar to many of our listeners in the way that many contemporary states work and don't work. So based on that critique of liberalism, which of course, I mean, it's needless to say that it's much more complicated than simply that single point, but that is one of Schmitt's major points. What did Schmitt see as the alternative? I mean, you know, I almost hate to bring this up, but there's the old argument in favor of democracy that it's the best possible system, notwithstanding all of its faults, that it's essentially the worst form of government except for all of the others. You know, that quotation which is generally ascribed to Churchill, even though I think it might be apocryphal. But the idea that democracy, notwithstanding all of the ways in which it's unsuccessful and all of the problems it has, is still the best possible form of government. What would Schmitt foresee as the replacement for a liberal state?
Well, I must steer this question into a different direction, I'm afraid. But Schmitt largely discussed the question of the meaning of democracy itself, of the very term democracy, in one of his other works. I see that there's an English book, The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy. Yeah, I guess that's it, exactly. It was his first explicitly political work. In German, it's called Die geistesgeschichtliche Lage des heutigen Parlaments. And as I can see now, it's been translated into English as The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy, which is not a literal translation of the title, because it would rather be something akin to the intellectual and historical situation of contemporary parliamentarism. And in that, Schmitt discusses how parliamentarism in and of itself was a perversion of the original idea of democracy. And it is in there that he has written sentences like, I'm just paraphrasing here, that democracy demands a homogeneous society, and to preserve democracy, the heterogeneous must be excluded and, if necessary, exterminated. She was kind of hinting at concepts that had been around since the late 19th century, with works like Society and Community by Ferdinand Tönnies. That was published in 1887, where the problems of the back then German society already became apparent, and discussed the whole polarity, the
antithesis.
Yeah, pretty much. You have society, which is Gesellschaft in German on the one hand side, and you have Gemeinschaft, community, on the other side, and both demand other forms of government. Schmitt opted for a kind of basic German communitarian democracy, as inspired by the antique Greek polis, like Athens, for example, whereas the pluralistic society of Imperial Germany and in the Weimar Republic demanded a parliamentary democracy which was doomed to fail, as was shown at the very end of the Weimar Republic, since starting with the economic crisis, the global economic crisis caused by the Black Friday, and which led Schmitt to believe that it was necessary to, at least for a certain time, to restore law and order, to turn Germany from a parliamentary democracy into a republic, the Weimar Republic, into a presidential dictatorship ruled by the Reich president, which was back then Paul von Hindenburg. And that's a very complicated issue, because the Weimar Constitution had installed the institution of the Reich president as the very protector of the Constitution and the Republic itself. That was something Schmitt argued a lot about with another very well-known legal scholar of that time, the Austrian Hans Kelsen. They were mainly arguing about whether the Reich the Reich president or the Constitutional Court were the true protector of the Constitution. And Schmitt also wrote a book about that question called Hüter der Verfassung, which is protector of the Constitution. And in the Weimar Constitution, there was the so-called, which gave the president a very broad and most extensive authority to issue necessity orders, Notverordnungen, kind of like the presidential orders Trump uses by now. Also, although the US are not in a state of emergency yet.
Right, and these orders that the president was given the power to issue were for states of emergency, if I'm not mistaken, in the Weimar Republic. Is that correct, Nils? Or were they also just generally?
Yeah, pretty much. The main reason to implement these orders were cases in which the parliament, which was normally responsible for enacting laws and controlling the executive, was not able to function. These emergency orders should be used in the spirit of the Weimar Constitution by the president, the Reich president, as kind of a last means to make sure the state would not fall apart. Because when Parliament is in cahoots and they won't reach any agreements anymore, there are no more laws that get passed, and the state is pretty much disabled.
This has a lot in common as well with older precedents, like the Roman practice of giving power to a dictator in times of emergency, in times of dire need, as a measure of last resort, but always with the understanding that this would be a temporary procedure. And I mean, the same thing obviously held in the case of the Weimar Republic and the Constitution.
Yeah, absolutely. There was the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the last resolution of the Senate in the Roman Republic, where given a state of emergency, the Senate would, to sum it up, the Senate would declare civil war for a certain time, give away all its powers to a elected dictator and dissolve itself for the time being until order was restored, which is also a very interesting history. And I do strongly believe that given his huge interest in ancient Greek and Roman history and legal matters, Schmitt was very well aware of and deduced a lot of his insight about the value of those Weimar Republic emergency orders from that.
Right, because the state of emergency is also one of the central concepts of his political theory. Could you say a little bit about Schmitt's particular idea of state of emergency?
It's kind of a rather philosophical approach in the very beginning, because Schmitt says that basically times of order where everything works as it has been planned and everything is peaceful and nice are essentially uninteresting times. They do not convey any assessment about political structures and their feasibility. Only a state of emergency or a state of exception, like foreign invasion, civil war, civil unrest, bloody clashes between different political parties, like in the end stage of the Weimar Republic, for example. Those are the times where a political structure of any kind must prove its worth, and everyone can see whether it is able to weather the storm or not. And those states of emergency, states of exception, are what Schmitt was mainly concerned about. As he famously wrote, that's one of his more literal sentences that have been very famous, still are, and are pretty much a part of history, at least of the political sciences now, is the concept of the state presupposes the concept of the political, and sovereign is he who decides on the state of exception, which is, the latter one is kind of a funny, not that funny pun, because as in German as well as in English, the word sovereign or souverän in German has both a nominal and an adjective meaning. It means the very institution or the individual that is the sovereign of a given state, as well as the adjective being sovereign, wielding the political power. And that basically boils down to whoever is able to declare and to determine a state of emergency or state of exception is the one who is actually sovereign. And there have been some very witty political commentators in recent months in Germany that argued that assuming this sentence, sovereign is he who decides on the state of exception, is true, that would prove that Angela Merkel and the German parliament are not sovereign in the Federal Republic of Germany, because they were pretty much helpless when the migrant crisis crashed into Europe and into Germany especially, and they have been dominated, and their actions and reactions determined by other powers, be it the churches who kept on shilling for taking in more migrants, or humanitarian NGOs, be it George Soros and his Open Societies Foundation and the like. The state of Germany and its main institutions, which would be the parliament, the Bundestag, and Mrs. Merkel as Bundeschancellor, were not sovereign to the degree that they just had to stand at the side of the political playground and
Right, so this raises some very interesting implications. In the first place, the idea of the sovereign as the one who can determine a state of exception has the distinct implication that the sovereign in some ways, and certainly in the most important moments, stands above the law, is superior to the legal framework in which the citizenry certainly must live on a day-to-day basis. And I believe that Schmitt himself certainly drew some ramifications from this idea in that direction with his concept of authority and power. Did he, I mean, we today have this idea of the checks and balances, or a limited system in which there are individual distinct powers who, pulling and pushing against one another, keep each other in line. Did Schmitt believe that there should be any kind of control over the sovereign, or did he believe that the very idea of the sovereign in a certain way rejects the very notion of control?
Schmitt was heavily influenced by Thomas Hobbes as well as Machiavelli, and he saw that any given constitution as the fundament of a legal system needed protection, and this protection could only be provided by a sovereign who, in a state of exception, a state of emergency, given certain circumstances, could be forced to act against the letters of the Constitution to preserve the meaning of the Constitution. He already outlined that in his most important scientifical law scholarly work, the Verfassungslehre, the constitutional theory, with which he pretty much founded a whole new realm of legal studies, where he constructed the theory of a unchangeable core at the very heart of the Constitution, and around that all the laws and legal matters that come with it, and that can, if necessary, be abolished for a certain length of time until justice and order are restored. And that was actually what Schmitt suggested immediately before the National Socialist Party came to power in 1933. The Constitution, to Schmitt, sometimes must be protected. The essence, the core of the Constitution, to Schmitt, sometimes must be protected by getting rid of the excessive weight of too many laws that paralyze the executive and the given protector of the Constitution. In the Weimar Republic's case, the Reich President. In a state of emergency, that is.
Of course, of course. So this suggests to me in turn that Schmitt had some kind of a concept of the desirable state, the state that should exist. I think that with many thinkers, also Hobbes and Machiavelli, who you just mentioned, there is a temptation to some extent to take them as being realists, and then to further draw the implication that a realist is one who looks at things as they are rather than as they should be. And of course, there are many reasons also to at least to look at Machiavelli and Hobbes in this light. Nonetheless, there's also a way in which all of these thinkers are suggesting changes in the structure of the state, which in turn suggests the necessity of bringing up some kind of political good or a political aim toward which we should be directing our political action and our political efforts. And returning, for example, to the quip that you made about the German government, Angela Merkel, not being a sovereign because the people who are supposedly ruling at present don't have the ability to call a state of exception. That comes back as well to Schmitt's critique of liberalism as being a system of indecision, in which decisions cannot be taken, cannot be made. And Schmitt's focus on action and the importance of deciding, obviously, in that case, casts a certain kind of, I'd hesitate to say moral, but it casts a certain shadow on the liberal state, and it implies that the non-liberal state, a state with a solid sovereign, a sovereign who is capable of making decisions when the time is meet, this is the better state in some way. This is the state that we should be attempting to construct, or that we should be attempting to encourage.
Yeah, I guess you're pretty right on that. But I must say that regarding concrete visions of a state as it should be, according to his own beliefs, Schmitt did not really make too much of those. He gave some speeches about what he envisioned as the preferable final form of the Weimar Republic, which simply was a strong state, a strong executive state with a, as he called it, healthy economy, in which he kind of touched topics that ordo-liberalism would usually discuss. And I have not yet searched for any work that would actually look for similarities in the political work of Carl Schmitt and that of Hans Hermann Hoppe. But I guess since Hoppe in Democracy, the God That Failed, admitted that liberalism in the way that libertarians understand it is only possible a totalitarian state, because otherwise people would just go back to the natural state and start slitting each other's throats for, I don't know, a gallon of gasoline or something like that. And there's this Hobbesian assumption again, which Schmitt also drew from. And I think both Schmitt and Hoppe know that people are simply not able to rule themselves. They need a state that protects them, but also keeps them from killing one another. And they need a constitution in which their rights and their duties are outlined in a more or less unmistakable way to keep them from committing crimes or trying to subdue one another. Because human nature simply doesn't function like that.
Right. So, I mean, just to ask you a very, very strange question about that idea that there should be a state which orders human beings and that stops them from massacring one another. I mean, I guess my question might simply be why? And let me attempt to explain that a little bit. It seems to me that modern political philosophy, and Schmitt seems to be representative of modern political philosophy straight from the very roots of it in Machiavelli and Hobbes, to some extent, modern political philosophy would like to step away from the idea of a political ideal. It sees in the political ideal a kind of unrealizable, imaginary, fantastical city in the sky or castle in the sky. Machiavelli used the term imaginary principalities to deride this notion. And in moving away from that, they want to establish a more realistic form of government. But this realistic form of government seems always to take its basis to some extent on an idea of human nature and what the human being is. And so when I ask the question, why does he want this state? I mean, would you think that it might be a satisfactory answer to say he wants this state because it is the state that most completely is fit for human nature? Does that seem like an adequate response?
I would think so, yes. Given Schmitt's assumption that democracy is only feasible in homogeneous societies, this kind of, although that's an ex post assertion, of course, this kind of makes the case for ethnopluralism or something like that. I don't want to go into that too much. Ethnopluralism is a topic for itself with its very own problems. But given a society that is homogeneous and that is ruled by this very basic form of people's democracy, there's a certain stratum of Schmitt's political Catholicism, I guess, that kind of overarches this whole idea. Because in a secular society, in a secular homogeneous society, you would have a elected leader of some sort, maybe a king, maybe a president, whatever the name of it may be, but a sovereign who rules and who's the one deciding no matter what, anything. Of course, he has a certain staff of people around him who support him, but in this idea of there's a term coined by Max Weber, I believe, for that, and it's more or less a totalitarian leader, or to use this term, Führer democracy. Kind of like in the ancient German tribes, where you have chief and the other ones do as he says, and the ting or the tribe meeting lets him decide what is to do and simply acclamates. Acclamation in this Schmittian sense would be the way of the people as the actual quote unquote sovereign, as in democratic societies, to muse their support for the decision of their actually sovereign leader. And the way or the necessity to organize human societies or human communities in this way is, on the one hand, derived from Hobbes and his natural state, which must be avoided by any means necessary, and on the other hand, from the Christian dogma of caring for one another, because it is, of course, a good thing to do, first, not to kill one another, second, to prevent others from killing third parties, and around this dogma, a necessity of state-like organization, even if it's only in tribal communities, can be constructed, to my belief. I hope this in some way answered the...
No, absolutely. I mean, this is obviously we're getting into some very tangled territory here. It's not easy to work this out, and in some ways, this reflects Schmitt himself as a thinker, I believe, because he's very difficult to pin down, and this tends to be true of thinkers who are very deep or very original, that you can't put them into the same kinds of easy categories and simplifications that you can with sort of run-of-the-mill, everyday things.
Absolutely. Schmitt himself has also been called the Heraclitus of political science, because especially when it gets really radical and sometimes dangerous, Schmitt almost every time gets a bit ambiguous, and that's also something that kind of makes up his aura as a political writer, because his language is very dramatical, and there's some dark vibrancy there, and you can interpret your own assumptions and your own the intellectual horizon you're coming from yourself into many of his writings, which also attracted many young socialist legal scholars to Schmitt back when he was a legal professor himself, because he was agitating against the old-fashioned bourgeois society, which socialists, of course, also wanted to overturn. And on the other hand, ever since 9/11, there has been this huge misunderstanding that neoconservatism would draw largely from Schmitt, and especially his friend and enemy distinction by enacting things like the Patriot Act, or using this construct. What is it called again? The unitary executive theory, which is kind of like this emergency. These emergency order law from the Weimar Republic, that in case of a massive threat against the United States, president should be the one to control the whole executive branch, and there's no holds barred when it comes to legal terms, even regarding human rights, and people can be detained indefinitely at Camp X-Ray and waterboarded and stuff like that, as long as they are enemies of the state. That is not exactly a Schmittian viewpoint, but of course, as I said, Schmitt is very often very ambiguous, and people who want to interpret a certain meaning, especially ex post from today's viewpoint, into the writings Schmitt wrote, can always do that. Which is why, if I may note that, finishing this excursion, it is said that Schmitt influenced the Western German quasi-constitution, the Grundgesetz, as well as actually the Israeli constitution when the state of Israel was. Yeah, many will reject that. Tons of hints on and secretive allusions to Schmittian works. But as I said, if one wants to interpret Schmitt this way or another, to a certain degree, because Schmitt has been vague or ambiguous many times.
And in that, again, he falls into a very good company with his teachers, Hobbes and Machiavelli, who are both very much similar in that respect. I mean, to an extent, I am somewhat sympathetic to the objection that putting too much focus on the powers that a sovereign figure should and actually does have is in a certain way politically dangerous, particularly at our historical juncture, because we live in liberal societies which are much less stable than they like to pretend to be. And I mean, Schmitt obviously had, as you pointed out very, very rightly, Schmitt had a very nuanced view of what democracy meant. The ancients tended to believe that democracies would usually give birth to tyrannies, or at least there was that possibility inherent in democracies. And with that in mind, I can certainly understand the concerns of one who might look at Schmitt and think that he is perhaps being in some ways irresponsible with his ambiguities and with his concentration on the importance of the sovereign, insofar as there is the possibility that a liberal system might collapse and devolve into a tyranny, which, particularly given the technology which is open to us today, is of enormous and unprecedented hazard for the life of societies. I mean, this is obviously putting a lot on your shoulders, Nils, but I wonder if you might imagine what a possible Schmittian response to this kind of objection could be.
Well, there we actually get at the heart of Schmitt's work, or that part of his oeuvre, which he is mainly known for nowadays, and that has been our work, der Begriff des Politischen, the concept of the political. Most people, especially nowadays, I guess even back in the 19th century and especially in the Weimar Republic, but also as nowadays, tend to simply misunderstand the nature of politics and the nature of power, and blaming Schmitt for that because he dared to outline this is a classical case of shooting the messenger. Because, you see, Schmitt's definition of the politics is a eternal struggle for power. People tend to forget that because we are liberal democracies, but every sooner or later there are situations in which they are reminded of that, but tend to sugarcoat them. Like, for example, in Austria these days, the Austrian is involved in a court case based on a paragraph that was introduced, as far as I've understood, into the Austrian criminal law for combating organized crime. I've not actually looked into it as much, both the Austrian one and the US one, which I will get at now. But as I heard about this case and the law involved, it made me think immediately of the American RICO Act, because these laws against organized crime, and I guess every law-abiding would be 100% positive that organized crime must be fought, depend on what is deemed criminal in a given society. And the decision, we're at the decision thing again, the decision about what is criminal and what is not is usually made by the sovereign, or in liberal democracies, the party or the parties that are in power. Of course, logically, if one is not as much of an optimist that are actually working towards the greater whole of the whole society, naturally, those parties want to stay in power. So the easiest way is to declare any activity criminal that would endanger their position of power. Of course, we are not talking about a postmodern enabling act here, or suspending legal order to get political dissidents right away into some FEMA camp or something like that. At least not now. But penalizing certain things, just such as sedition or racist remarks, whatever that may be, of course serves the purpose of prolonging and consolidating the power of those wielding the power to make law right now. And people who say that a certain government, or even a form of government, would be totally great if just other people were making the law, simply ignore the very essence of this struggle for power. That's what Schmitt's concept of the political is all about. It's an eternal struggle. It's not always a bloody, decisive battle, but it's an eternal struggle for power. Those who do not have power want it, and those who have power want to keep it. And democracy makes many people forget about that, because they seem to think that casting ballot every 4 or 5 years would be perfectly fine for them to execute their sovereign powers as the demos of the given state, and the people making the laws and deciding about who's to be thrown in jail and who's to be put at vital positions in society would do so because of altruistic reasons, because they want everyone to be happy, something like that. But
right.
it's pretty sad, but empirical data speaks loudly against that.
So indulge me for a moment while I play the devil's advocate, and I'm going to play the devil's advocate in two separate ways here, because I'm going to be arguing in a certain sense in favor of liberalism, of which I am highly skeptical, and from the point of view of American constitutionalism, which I believe to be in many, many ways deeply flawed. But I can imagine presenting a kind of argument that runs in this way.
All right.
The American founding fathers were certainly not ignorant of Schmitt's insight that politics is very often, if not always, reducible to a struggle for power. Their response to this was to attempt to establish a system in which that very drive toward power could be essentially compromised, neutralized, or at least limited by the similar drive to power of other figures, other institutions, other politicians within the political realm. The goal of this was essentially to attempt to contain that striving after power so that it didn't break any kinds of bonds to such an extent that it might degenerate into a system of simply tyrannical rule or a single individual or a single group of individuals being excessive reign over the destiny and the rights of other human beings. Now, given that human beings are interested in power, and perhaps political human beings in particular, might it not be best to attempt to establish a system of government in which precisely indecision is the rule of the day, insofar as it stops any given human being from acquiring an excess of power and exercising it tyrannically over the remainder of society? And again, note that I say this very much as the devil's advocate here, but I think that this is, at least in some ways, worth considering, particularly since I believe, in a certain sense, it's even a Machiavellian argument, taking Machiavelli from his work on the Republic rather than on the Prince. But
yeah, well, I guess this would be a legitimate argument if all people were actually equal. But since they are not, there's always someone who's going to be stronger, someone who is more powerful, not in a political way, but in a purely physical way. And to hold a state together, even a state of deliberate indecision, as you constructed this mind game right now, there needs to be an executive, a police force or army or militia of some sort. And if a given government should decide that it would be best to just balance everyone's particular egoistical group interests against those of others to keep everyone in check, the most natural thing, given people's appetite for power, would be that there would be a coup d'etat by the military or the police force or what have you. That's what happened in the later stages of the Roman Empire. Almost like every 3 or 4 years, the Praetorian Guard would simply kill the emperor if he would not pay them enough money, and enthrone a new emperor or something like that. And since there will always be people who are more powerful than others, and all people are thirsting for power, a state of constant indecision and let's say passivity and petrification would not last a year or so, I believe. That's human nature at work. That would be human nature at work. But again, that's me talking here, Carl Schmitt, and I'm just channeling some of the things I learned from him, as well as from Hobbes and Machiavelli.
Certainly. Yeah, I mean, I think that your critique is certainly well placed. I think that the least that could be said from a kind of Schmittian perspective, with the very little that I understand of Schmitt, might be that a state of indecision is always going to be weak against a state which has a living and vital sovereign who is capable of making decisions.
Absolutely. A state or anyone who has power but decides not to wield it, whatever reason for that might exist, simply decides to be ruled by others. There's actually a Schmitt himself in the concept of the political, which boils down to. I'm just trying to remind myself of it. That's one of those Schmitt quotes one should always have ready when talking about politics.
Right.
Schmitt constructed the realm of actual politics as the realm where this concept of the political was valid. That is, where the eternal struggle for power was alive. And he wrote, because he anticipated that certain people would be like, oh my God, eternal struggle, no, we've had this enough, and oh no, no struggle anymore, can't we just all be friends, and maybe we will all sign some treaties, and okay, I will not harm you, you will not harm me. Schmitt was a large critic of the League of Nations, for example, because he saw treaties like the Briand-Kellogg Pact, which was an attempt to simply outlaw war, which obviously was not very effective.
Right.
Schmitt wrote, if a people becomes incapable or unwilling to hold itself in the sphere of the political, that does not mean that the sphere of the political ceases to exist. The only thing that ceases to exist is a weak people.
That's a very nice turn of phrase. And I think,
there's this meme about weak should fear the strong, and this also holds true what we are talking about. One, there will always be the strong. Two, there will always be the weak. And three, the strong will always try and probably eventually succeed in subduing the weak. That's the human condition. And one might like that or not, but that's what politics and pretty much most human interactions are all about. I'm channeling Ragnar Redbeard and his might is right a bit, but...
well, there's something to be said for it. I mean, there's something very compelling about the argument that no matter what systems or states we attempt to construct, there will always be precisely the strong man who will be capable of bending them or taking advantage of them at his will. And I think this is actually absolutely a critique which can be brought against the kind of checks and balances systems that we have in place today, which have this pretense of being able to contain the human power lust. Because essentially what happens is, rather than containing that power lust, they simply move it up a level. And so what you have is a situation in which the politicians very often become figureheads that everybody believes are sovereign, as you pointed out with the German government, and I believe the same thing could be said for any number of states in the West today. And above them, there is a kind of secret and very real power structure which begins to form and to manipulate the entire system toward its own aims and its own ends. That might be a very slow process, and there might be a time, kind of a grace period, in which people live very happily and in very, very pleasant and blissful ignorance about what's really happening. But sooner or later, the raw nature of power does come out in a system like that.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's probably a topic for a whole
indeed
new podcast.
Absolutely,
because that's been a topic of discussion for political science and political philosophy I guess, the last 200 years or so.
And it's interesting that it's come out so much in modern times, because it indicates something particular about the days in which we live. The philosophers, the political philosophers and the political thinkers of past times didn't focus so much on power, and I think that there was a reason for that. It's not that they didn't see the same problems, it's that the problems that they confronted maybe had a certain element to them that is lacking today, in large part thanks, I think, in my personal opinion, to thinkers like Machiavelli and Hobbes, who in a certain way broke open a kind of Pandora's box, and we're all living in it at present. So, that's...
Yeah, I partially agree, but just personally, I believe that this paradigm shift is mainly connected to the Industrial Revolution, because the Industrial Revolution and industrialization of Western states and Western societies was the event or the process that put the economy into a position where it was able to challenge the primate of the state or of politics. And this whole, let's call it misery, without wanting to sound too reactionary. It's probably good that Charles isn't here for that matter.
No.
This whole misery lasted almost 250 years now, and look at the situation we are in. Economics largely determine political decisions, if they are made at all. Whereas, in an ideal state, at least in a postmodern right-wing ideal state, the exact opposite should be true. But that's also a topic that requires an own podcast, because we get into corporatism there, and one could talk about the so-called New Deal, and of course the theoretical foundations of Italian fascism come to mind, and stuff like that. Those desperate attempts to close the economical Pandora's box again. But well, as I said, that's a very large topic too, and with that we would probably won't spend too much time before touching the problem of international high finance, and we all know where we go from there.
Yes, I mean, I agree with you absolutely about the importance and the centrality of the Industrial Revolution, although in my mind, the Industrial Revolution itself could not have occurred without the preceding philosophical revolution, which was undertaken again by figures like Machiavelli and Hobbes, but we can also look to figures like Bacon, Adam Smith, these individuals who in a certain sense were breaking free of the control of the church. I mean, I think that there's a very central point here in the birth of the idea of power out of these individuals, also the birth of the idea of history out of these individuals, which is connected very intimately to the withdrawal, even the reaction to the Catholic Church, the power of Christianity, anti-theological ire, as it's been described. And this, I think, can actually maybe take us to what we can use as our closing point in this conversation about Schmitt, because one of the interesting facets of Schmitt is that you have, on the one hand, this extremely raw vision of human politics as being a kind of continual conflict of powers and a continual attempt to gain power, and in a certain way, even a necessary and desirable system of powers, which is the only way of actually expressing a full society. So on the one hand, you have this very realpolitik vision of things, and on the other hand, you have Schmitt's very interesting and somewhat conflictual relationship, so far as I understand it, with Catholicism. As I understand it, he was a thoroughgoing Catholic. He was actually excommunicated on his second marriage because he didn't annul his first, if I'm not mistaken.
That's partly right. Back then, the Catholic Church did not accept a divorce and a second marriage. You could get first annulled by the legal authority, as Schmitt did back in, I believe it was 1920. Let me just have a quick look. Yeah, it was in 1924. And maybe we should let the listeners know what this was all about. In 1915, while he was a volunteer for the army, Schmitt married a woman named Paula Dorotich, who claimed to be a Serbian countess, but later proved a fraud, much to Schmidt's chagrin. And so he desperately tried to have this marriage revoked, which the Catholic Church refused to do. This even went to a theological, I don't know what it is called in church language, to a theological court, a dogmatic court in Rome, but they decided that they could not annul this marriage because back then, as I said, the Catholic Church looked at marriage as sacred. You get married once and your marriage ends with both of the partners being dead. So when Schmitt had his first marriage legally annulled in 1924, and then a year later,
he had it legally annulled from the legal point of view. Is that correct? He was divorced.
Yeah, by the.
But it was never annulled by the church itself.
No, that's where we get at now. Because a year after the marriage was legally annulled, he married. We are in 1925 now. He married one of his former students, a woman, also a Serbian, a woman called Duška Todorović. And because of that, he got excommunicated from the Catholic Church and remained excommunicated until his second wife died. She died very young in 1950. But that was a experience with the Catholic Church, which Schmitt, I would not say adored, but respected so much, respected in a non-ironic, memed way here, respected so much that he even devoted one of his most, let's say, interesting works to it, and that would be Römischer, in English, Roman Political, and it has been translated as well, yes, since 1996. This is kind of a side note regarding his topic, his motif of political theology, because in this small brochure he talks about how Roman Catholicism and the institutions of the Catholic Church influenced the structure of secular states, because they are, or ever since the Enlightenment up until now, they have been modeled to a certain degree after the institutions of the Catholic Church, which have remained pretty much unchanged ever since the Middle Ages.
Right, and that too opens us up into very complicated and a very fraught topic, which would be the relation of religion to politics, which I think would actually be very, very interesting to delve into a little bit from a Schmittian perspective. But since we're drawing on time, I think it might be best to leave off here. And Nils will simply have to do another podcast in which we discuss these matters more in depth.
Yeah, looking at the clock, I anticipated that. Well, as I said, those are two huge individuals, and it's not even possible to handle each one of them in a short matter.
No, indeed. We could have dedicated an entire podcast, I'm sure, to a single book, but obviously if we go about doing that, we'll never get through anything at all. So to some extent, unfortunately, we've got to elide over some very interesting material. But at any rate, Nils, it's been very, very interesting having you on today. I appreciate very much the insight and the background that you've given us on Schmitt, and thank you very much for joining us.
It's been an honor and a pleasure. Just call me up whenever you need me. And as I said, the outline of Mohler's life and work is still available. So I guess we will hear one another again.
Absolutely, we will. All right, so with that, we'll be closing today's podcast. This is the first podcast of the next season of Interregnum, and we certainly hope that you'll join us for our next podcast in 2 weeks' time. Thank you all for joining us, and until next podcast.
Auf Wiedersehen.